so let's go ahead and jump over, and I think Kelsey is ready for us.
Yes,
There
I'm
he
here.
is. Let me stop sharing my screen. What's up? You there? What's going on, man? This is exciting, man. Let me stop sharing my screen if I can figure that out. Okay. And let's get started, man. So how are you today?
Well, my internet's working, and I finally got the join link, so I think I'm on top of things.
All right, well, good, man. So let's start with like a little background. Like, what do you do? Like, what's your title, I guess? Where do you work?
I'm a principal developer advocate in the engineering org at Google Cloud. So there's a lot into that. So people always ask, and I know you got the question queued up, what's a developer advocate? And I would say I'm probably not the best person to ask, because I think I do a few of the activities that most people would link to developer advocacy. Like they may see me speak at an event or do a podcast, but a lot of my work is actually product focused. And I work at an executive level. That means I sponsor some of our bigger customers, plan go-to-market strategies, how products should be priced. But I think most people in tech that are building things have this kind of advocacy responsibility. If you build something, part of your job is going to raise awareness about that thing. And if it doesn't work for people, make changes until it does.
Got it. No, that's great. Because I think you're right. I think a lot of people are, first of all, I think the developer advocacy role is a very critical role. And I'm starting to see, more people of color jumping in that role, but it's just, I still don't see enough. So I'm glad that you kind of like defined that for us. Like, let's just start with some simple questions. Like, where did you grow up?
Yeah, I was born in Georgia. So, from the A, but I grew up in Long Beach, California, which is vastly different in kind of energy and vibe. So I grew up during the era of like Nintendo, Too Short trying to give us the game, X-Clan giving us directions to the east backwards, and playing a lot of sports outside.
Got it. Okay. Like, like, how did you get into technology? Like, I mean, what made you get into it?
I think like a lot of people, I spent, my first jobs were in like fast food, and, I did pretty well in school. But when I started to look at the whole college paradigm, it's like, what do I actually want to do? And most roles didn't really appear interesting to me. I didn't want to be a doctor, didn't want to be a lawyer, all respectable roles. But I was really interested in this whole technology thing, mainly because, this is like Bill Gates is hot, Steve Jobs is hot, the .com right before the bubble burst. There was so much excitement around the internet and what people were doing with it. I wanted to get into that particular career. And so for a lot of people, I studied for my A+ certification just to try to kick the tires and maybe learn what this field was all about. And I started my career by, I was like a lot of people. I was super intimidated applying for jobs, right? You see these job postings, you need 5 years of Java, you need 100 years of this other thing. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to start my own consulting business, open a small computer store in Atlanta. And I ran that for a number of years. And that's how I got a lot of experience in terms of managing technology, integrating it into a business before I really jumped into what most would consider a tech career.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. So, so as a young man, like as a kid, did you have a computer? Did you have a computer at the
Yeah, so
crib?
for me, I'm one of those late people. I didn't get my first computer until like 11th grade, right? I bought a laptop from a neighbor. And the only reason why I got the laptop was so I can play video games, right? I'm playing Age of Empires or whatever game you could play on the PC back then. So it was not about like learning how to program. That came much later in my career. So I think a lot of people, if you're listening, it's never too late to get started. But as a kid, I always thought about sports and like being cool and those kind of things. And I really didn't have a career focus or a hobby in technology.
Got it. Okay. Let me ask this though. Like if I fast forward, like to Coral S, like that was the first time like I kind of saw you, right? So I know it's kind of weird. I feel like a stalker saying it to you, but that's when I like first like saw this guy giving a talk. I don't even know what it was, but I just saw this guy, very charismatic, a lot of personality, talking about a piece of technology. And you kind of already talked about the developer advocacy role, but was that your first time in that role, or how did you get into that role?
Yeah, so at CoreOS, you got to remember where I am in my career at that point. I'm about 12 years into the industry. I've been a director of engineering, VP of engineering. I've ran ops teams, development teams, built stuff, built open source projects. I've seen the game from many lenses. And if you think about what most leaders do, a lot of times there's going to be a part of their work is going to be their public persona. How do you talk about the vision of the company that you're with? And also, how do you shape the industry around you? I think that is the ultimate goal for most technologists. Of course, you can always sit behind the keyboard and pump out code, but at some point, there's other ways to impact the world around you. So at CoreOS is kind of a culmination of this career. We get to CoreOS. This is a small startup at the time. I think we were like 12 people, but they're on the edge of this container movement. So for me, I'm super excited because I'm no longer working in a kind of tried and true area or space, right? Config management, DevOps, automation, writing applications. Like, I get that. That's all tried and true. But this container thing was looking to kind of push the boundaries and do something that no one knew was going to even work out, but it looked like an obvious pattern that could work for the masses. So when I joined CoreOS, you're still contributing to open source projects. One of the things I did was contribute to Kubernetes super early on. But what tends to happen, though, as a company of that size, you don't have a marketing team. You're not buying ads and magazine articles. So one of the job of the two founders, Alex Povey and Brandon, their job was to really sell the vision to the world. And when I joined the company, it turned out that I could actually play a major role in that. So one of the roles I had there was the product leader. I was the product manager for where we should take the product portfolio next. But a lot of that came from, we were building things and being done on Tuesday. And I would go and give a meetup conversation on Friday to say, hey, look at this thing we just built. We just shipped this new feature in etcd. Let me explain it to you how it worked. Because I think the need back then was, we were building things on the edges of distributed systems that most people, our target audience, didn't have experience with. So it's not one of those things where you can say, hey, here's etcd, go figure out what to do with it. No, you have to say, here's etcd, here's what it replaces. Here's what the current experience you have. Here's how you leverage it to use a tool like this. So you saw me do a lot in the public because where the whole industry was with technology, it wasn't going to take off until we showed people how it was supposed to.
Okay. No, that's dope. So I didn't realize this. So it's kind of like you weren't really a developer advocate. You kind of just fell into that role basically because you were helping them basically showcase and kind of explain to the world what they were building. Is that kind of how it happened?
Yeah, but basically? Like I said, most people in their career, you're going to get there. I met Satya, the CEO of Microsoft, about a year and a half ago. And on the way to meet him, right, you're going to read his book, right? His book had just come out, Hit Refresh. So he's now the CEO of Microsoft, and it's time to hit refresh. And one of the opening chapters, he talks about his first role at Microsoft was an advocate. I think he used to be a cloud advocate back in those early days. And as an advocate, and now as the CEO of Microsoft, he felt that he was advocating for the soul of Microsoft. So this advocacy thing is just the lens into the work. Rob Pike, Robert Griesenmore, Ken Thompson, they build this programming language called Golang. But guess what? You can't just build a language and put it on GitHub. Rob Pike has to go basically do all of these keynotes to showcase what the language is all about, why we built it, how to use it. And the other part of advocacy, no matter what role you have to be able to take feedback from the community and turn it into something that you can actually ship. So I think a lot of times when people approach advocacy, they might see the external part, like, oh, this person is speaking at a conference. This person wrote a book. This person is engaging on social media. And if you look at that kind of advocacy, that's cool. It's part of the program, but it's kind of closer to evangelism. And there's nothing wrong with evangelizing for things that you believe in. But to me, advocacy starts with the work. When you build something and you ship it, there's a lot that goes into that process. And then when it's done, a bit of advocacy is going to be required to raise awareness, get adoption, and establish that feedback loop. That's what engineering is about. It's a big feedback loop, and you're advocating for the people on the other side of the software.
I like it. Okay. No, I appreciate it. It's an interesting way of looking at it. So let's move on to around some technical topics cloud computing. Obviously, you sunk your teeth into Kubernetes and Istio, right? Obviously, Kubernetes has definitely cemented itself as a core component of this modern cloud computing movement. Why did you sink yourself into Kubernetes and Istio? What drew you to it?
Experience. When you're in the game this long, and luckily for me, I spent time, we always talk about the T-shaped engineer. And this is when over the course of your career, if you go deep in the areas that you're focused on, so maybe you're starting out and maybe you're doing PHP and WordPress, go super deep, because if you go super deep, you're going to eventually learn about things like HTTP. You're going to learn about how PHP code and the runtime actually works, CPU and memory and threads. You're going to go that deep. But then maybe your next job, you're writing automation tools for networking gear. So this starts to fill out your T over time. When you think about what Kubernetes does, some people see it as an application platform where you can deploy your containerized applications. That's one way to look at it. But if you think about what it really is, if you take a whole operations team, a DevOps or SRE, and you gave them enough time and enough experience, what kind of platform would they build? More than likely, they're going to build some distributed system. They have compute across multiple regions. They're going to have to glue those things together and abstract it away so people can leverage the resources underneath. All of my career, we have been building tools. I was an engineer at Puppet Labs building configuration management tools. I've open sourced some projects trying to solve various problems in this space. And then when you think about it, you step back. And if you just look at what Kubernetes does and all of its components, it's what happens when you take a bunch of system administrators with enough experience and expertise and say, produce something, this is what it will look like. So that what drew me in is I know this is what people are building. They may not know what they're building. Most people don't know what a scheduler is and how do you examine a workload ahead of time and place it on a machine. And when I ask people that question, it turns out they're the scheduler, right? The company hired them to figure out what machine apps go on. It's because they don't have that necessary, that understanding that whole thing can be automated, but you need a different set of tools and a different way of thinking about it.
Got it. So one of the things, two things. So you co-authored a book on Kubernetes, right? So I went and got my copy from, I didn't go get a copy. I ordered it from Amazon. Was super excited, super geeked, to see, first of all, self-publishing a book versus actually going through a very known publisher such as O'Reilly is huge. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but how was that experience for you? For those who were writing blogs and doing all kind of other stuff, do you kind of recommend people kind of get into that game, or maybe just tell us your insight?
If you really want to, it's a hard process. When I started that book, I already had a relationship with O'Reilly. I was the chair of OSCON and still am for many years. And so I grew up learning tech through O'Reilly books, right? I will go to the bookstore and find a book on Python or Linux. And I remember buying those books. So I always attribute my early teachings to the authors of those books, right? We always say self-taught, but what we really mean is that we never met some of our teachers. And in those worlds, I always wanted to have one of the animal books, right? They're notoriously known for having books with an animal on it. So since I had a relationship, you don't typically get to do this, but I picked my animal. I wanted, it's a killer whale because they swim in pods, and a pod is a core component of Kubernetes. So I found that image and I started the outline, and I got about, I would say 80, maybe 70% done with the book. And that's when I kind of hit this thing of, I can't write anymore. And I also was good friends with Brendan Burns and Joe Beta, the two other co-authors. And I brought them in at that 70% point. So we had already been advertising the book, and they were sponsors for the first couple of chapters. So the book had been out in some form for maybe 6 months to a year before those two came on. but they really added this other point of view to polish things up and round it out in a very good way. And so I think the nice thing about writing a book like that is that you get to dump all your knowledge and expertise in a format that can have more people level up much faster in a scalable way, right? We can only talk to so many people in person. So I was happy to be able to return the favor that my invisible teachers did for me back in the day.
Yo, that's a monumental statement and quote, actually. So really what it is like you write once, right? And people can be shared by multiple people, right? So that's pretty dope. What do you kind of see like as trends now? Like what should we be looking out for? How should somebody who's in this space that's either in DevOps, or maybe they're in traditional infrastructure and they're trying to level up to DevOps because they know that the traditional data center is not necessarily where growth will be. So what do you think?
I noticed people talk about level up quite a bit in the threads. Like when things kicked off, people were talking about leveling up. We saw that in the opening sizzle reel. And the thing about leveling up is, first step is you got to know where you are. I think a lot of people they don't have enough clarity on where they are. I've met people that have been in this business for 20 years, but they have 20 years of 1 year experience. So they may think that they're senior engineers based on time, but they don't necessarily have the breadth of experience required. And so I think the couple of trends you got to look out for is that most of the new stuff rhymes with the old stuff. And so if you learn the fundamentals of whatever you're currently doing, my guess is most people that are watching this have 80% of the skills necessary to understand all of this new stuff, right? Back in my day, it was Apache, PHP, and MySQL. And then you look at the new stuff, then they call it cloud native and service meshes. But I'll promise you that 80% of it is exactly the same. Computing hasn't fundamentally changed that much in terms of fundamentals. Networking is roughly the same. The way we configure it is slightly different. We have APIs now and metadata and structured configurations, and that gives us the ability to interact with this stuff through control planes versus shell scripts. The other thing I think people need to kind of be aware of is that if you really want to go to that next level, people talk about legacy codes or infrastructure. And a lot of times it becomes legacy because people stop maintaining it, right? A lot of people get hired into tech and they're not the ones that created these systems. They simply inherit these systems. You don't know why they were created the way they were. So you just maintain them, right? Very little innovation happens when that's the mindset. So what you got to do is figure out how to break that loop. What's next? And if you can figure out what's next and pragmatically adopt these new technologies, because roughly they just rhyme with the ones you already have, then that's how you take things to the next level. Getting it into production is very different than kicking the tires on a POC.
Yeah, you're very true. I mean, all these things you're saying is just so true. But hearing you put it in that perspective, this makes you think about it, a little bit differently. Because you're right. I mean, a lot of these things hasn't just a new facade on it, a new wrapping around, a new way of doing things. So with that, let's take some questions from the audience. So if you have questions for Kelsey, please just drop them into the chat. Just put a Q in front of it, like a Q colon, right? That way I know it's a question versus other chatter that's going on. And we'll ask Kelsey some questions. While that's kind of happening, I'm just gonna just go over a couple of things that I I'm such a fan, man. I feel like a fanboy. It's so crazy. Because I remember being one of the for a couple of things. OSCON, I never saw a person of color be on the board at OSCON, and I thought that was super dope. Just briefly, we do have a question that came in, but just briefly, how did you get there?
Yeah, OSCON, the O'Reilly family, open source to me is that thing that equaled the playing field for me. When I started in tech, I didn't have money to go buy an expensive piece of hardware, some proprietary operating system to install on that hardware. So open source is look, I can go get a book for $20 download some open source on whatever I had in front of me, and then learn the same industry standards that are being practiced at the largest companies in the world. So my affinity to open source started way back then in my early career because it became the entry point. So I became, regardless of what my job title was at the time, I've always been a big fan of open source. So I was a contributor to Python. I used to contribute to pip and virtual env back in the day. I used to contribute to Puppet and a tool called Cobbler from the Red Hat folks. And so being embedded in these communities, it just made sense when O'Reilly approached me and said, hey, Kelsey, we see you out here giving these talks. We see your contributions to the open source space. How would you like to be a chair of OSCON, kind of the big open source conference? And that was one of the first, conferences that I went to back in my early days. So I felt it was an honor and a privilege. But one thing that I did know was going on that stage to provide that representation for people who normally look at these open source communities and they may not be able to identify with someone that looks like them. It was the reason why I'm still the chair 5 years later, because it's such an important event. And the whole world of open source is just even in the playing field globally for all people that want to get into this space and then exercise software engineering at the highest levels.
No, I appreciate that. No, that definitely. Thank you for that. So I got a question. So Brianna, I never can say your name right. I just don't beat me up. Was someone that has all of your experience and can work wherever you want, why did you choose Google?
It's funny, I didn't in the beginning. I went from CoreOS. My money game is right. I'm really fortunate. And so my next adventure was going to go to NASA, JPL. We all just saw the rover launch. I was working with JPL for a couple of years while I was at CoreOS. And I remember they gave me a demo of that rover that they sent to space, or at least a replica of it. And I remember just being so fascinated with the opportunity to work on something that would touch all of humanity, like going to Mars, the Mars mission. So I actually accepted an offer from JPL. It was all signed. I was going to move my family to Pasadena, and I would have been working for NASA, JPL, and leading a lot of the infrastructure and cloud stuff for the people that are powering some of those tools that power those experiments. And then I got a call from Google. And you got to think about it. I had already been deep in the Go community. I had already been deep in the Kubernetes community. I had a natural affiliation with a lot of Google technologies before joining the company. And when I sat down with the team, things just lined up. It helped that the money was greater. The ceiling in terms of pay was greater. And that was really attractive. But what was more attractive is that it was going to be one of those companies like CoreOS where I wouldn't have to try to figure out how to like the things that I was working on. I had already had a natural affinity. So Google, in its essence, was like the biggest stage I could be on to work and see the biggest problems. Google Cloud specifically, I can actually go work with hundreds and thousands of customers and not just one or two. So that was very appealing to take a lot of the work that I had been doing, this combination of contributing to open source, influencing the industry. This is not just about giving talks. It's about speaking to an existence with the world you want it to be, and then actually watching it happen in damn near real time. Google gave me a stage that let that be global. So it went from primarily a US-based set of activities to me speaking in almost every country in the world over the last 5 years. So that's why I ended up going to Google, and reflecting back, it was probably the best decision I made in my tech career.
That was dope. Let's ask another question. We got one more. We're at time, but I think we need to ask this. This is a good one. I want to hear your feedback on this one. What's your opinion on boot camps as a form of learning code? And I get asked this a lot too. So I want to hear your position on this.
You're never going to stop learning. So, it doesn't really matter. Like some people say, what's your position on like IT certifications? Do they matter? Well, they matter at some point in your career. So anything that helps you learn, whatever format or vehicle it takes, so you're never going to stop. Even when you graduate that boot camp, you're going to be going through some mini boot camp in some form, whether it's a crash course on the weekend, learning some new tech, joining a new team, and they have a training program. The thing I like about the boot camp is that is very focused on the fundamentals, right? They'll pick one or two languages. They're not going to go into decision paralysis. Oh, this is the best language, or this is the best database. Nope. They'll pick one because fundamentally, if you go deep on those, you'll actually be able to come and contribute fairly quickly. So the fact that they focus on building, I've actually been a part of one of the code school called Epicodus in Portland a couple years back. And I remember speaking to that, the first set of cohorts as they went out to get their first jobs, but more importantly, helping make sure that the curriculum was authentic and represented the real world. And I think most boot camps, not all, some of them are probably a little bit overpriced, but the thing that they bring to the game is they give people a little bit of that structure, focus on the skills, and they tend to have a decent path into actual getting a job in the space. So I applaud boot camps as an option. It isn't your only option though. So it's not like just go to the boot camp and call it good. You should do boot camps. You should do meetups. You should do a bit of self-study and just understand that even without the structure, you're going to be learning for the rest of your career.
Okay, no. So if I get I'm looking at a lot of questions here around like how can they follow you and how can they connect? What handle do you like to use?
I'm going to answer one more question because I see a lot of questions around.
Okay, good. Well, go for it.
And I think one important thing about the fundamentals is you cannot learn everything, and just be okay with it. There are times I wake up and say, maybe I should be spending more time in machine learning land. And so what I do to kind of quench that thirst, I'll have one-on-ones with people who do that all day. And I'll just listen, write notes, ask questions. Listen, write notes, ask questions. I might do a little tutorial here and there, but I want to know how much fundamental knowledge that I have translates to that world. And then I'll put it all on the shelf. I'm not going to stress out about being able to work as a machine learning person. I'm okay with that. So what I try to do is say, hey, what areas am I focused in? Do I even understand the fundamentals of the things I'm working in? So if you are writing HTTP web services, do you actually understand how HTTP works? Have you ever read the RFC? Do you know how SSL works? These are all adjacent technologies to the core thing that you're working on. So keep going deeper in the area you have. And then maybe the next job, you'll be focused on databases. And then you can talk about file systems and inodes and kernel tunings. Then just go deep for that. And over time, you'll be able to step back and say, wow, I learned a lot about a lot of things. And that's the right pace. You're never going to learn all at once. So I tend to focus on a strong core and just make sure that I understand my branches. And the branches tend to lead to the next technology. So just slow down, be patient, but don't forget to go deep. If you want to follow me, I'll be on Twitter. I'm just at Kelsey Hightower. My DMs are open. I'm known to jump on the phone or do one-on-ones like this with people so I can learn from them and also share what I know.
One other question real quick, because we got a couple of seconds here, I think. Okay. Let me ask you around this. So one of our sponsors, Dual Security, they're doing a talk on WebAuthn. The reason why they're doing that talk, because originally they were thinking about doing something on passwordless, which is what they're known for, passwordless security, or something that they're really focused on right now. But they had a real thoughtful conversation with us. They're like, we are working on this WebAuth W3C committee around obviously WebAuthn, and we want to have diversity and inclusion. We want more people of color to be involved in this W3C committee, and we want to basically come and talk about WebAuthn, and hoping that people would join the committee, for we'll get more more people of color to be involved. And I don't see a lot of people of color being involved in RFCs or W3Cs. So what's your take on that?
Boy, this is where you get in trouble with personal takes. If people would afford me room to have my own personal take and not be right? Because it's hard to talk about anything with the fear of not being right. Most of this stuff is actually pretty boring. If I don't care about WebAuthn or I don't care about some other standard, I'm not coming to that, whether I'm black, whether I'm white. I'm just not coming to that just because there's a lack of diversity. I think one thing we got to do is, why is it important? If it's important, and then are those communities accessible? Because a lot of things, if you think about all the open source projects on GitHub, I'm pretty sure the majority of them lack diversity too. The ones that don't lack diversity, like Terraform, the popular tools that we all use and we understand the value, then we tend to gravitate towards those. So one thing I would ask is, are these things accessible? Meaning, are there companies making time for someone to weigh in on these standards? Are you in your job, right? Some people say, hey, I'm a system administrator. Well, if you erase the title and you say, well, our company depends on Linux, so I'm going to go participate in the Linux Foundation to make sure our company can shape the future of this thing we depend on. So if you take the job titles away, I think what people of color can understand is that we have the opportunity to influence the direction of technology just like anyone else. And we have a different set of skills we can bring to the table as well. It's not all about writing the RFC from scratch. Sometimes you got to go and look at the RFC and say, yo, this ain't right. This is not how we do it in practice. And a lot of RFC's contributions are when people go and do the review stage, say, I don't know how I would use this in practice. Here's an example of where it falls apart. So I just don't think we understand how to access and engage in that process. So I think what we have to do is, if we want to see more people show up, we need to increase the transparency on the type of roles that are involved and the process on RFC. And I think you'll have more people showing up to engage. But again, it's got to be something we care about in order to attract our time, because we could be putting that time somewhere else.
Yeah, good point. Well, thank you, Kelsey Hightower. I really appreciate you, sitting down with this fireside chat. I really appreciate you supporting Hacking with the Homies. And Kelsey's really real. Let me just tell you, I just DM'd him. Like I've actually met Kelsey a couple other times. He probably doesn't remember little old me, but at OSCON. But I just DM'd him like, yo, I want you to come to this conference. And he, we started having that conversation. So again, I appreciate it.